or not that stood out, but we saw it really depends on the culture of your company, the local community that you want to engage with, regulations, especially as it relates to Web3. And these are just a few points that our speakers brought up. And then, of course, closing it out with how do we increase blockchain adoption? I feel like this is a question at every single conference and every other panel. And so we still have a long ways to go in terms of mass adoption. But each year we see the technology getting better, the use case is getting better, and that's great. So we have another panel coming up to join us on stage, and they'll be discussing Europe's role in blockchain innovation. So is everyone still awake with me? We're almost at lunchtime, yes? Yes? All right, great. So Europe's role in blockchain innovation. I would like to first welcome Dr. Martin Hock to the stage from FAS. Please give him a warm welcome, guys. We then have Tim Grant. Welcome, Tim, with Deus X Capital. Welcome to the stage. You gotta love this blazer, guys, right? Leon Marshall, welcome from Galaxy Europe. And Marguerite De Tavernost, welcome from Cathay Ledger Fund. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nova. Hello and good morning to everyone. Nova so kindly introduced you to the names of the people, but I want to tell you a little about who they are. So next to me is Tim Grant, CEO of Deus Capital, a billion-dollar investment company, yes. So focused on the digital asset and blockchain industry. And is also chairman of Alpha Lab 40, an institutional digital asset market maker and liquidity provider. Used to be head of EMEA at digital asset leading investor Galaxy Digital. And before this career in the blockchain industry, I take it, among other things, you've been managing director at UBS. So, which leads us directly to Leon Marshall, who actually has been with the UBS in former days, and he's CEO of Galaxy Europe, which links him to Tim as well, and global head of sales at Galaxy Digital. Previously he led the global sales team of Genesis Global Trading, yes, and like I said, he was also with UBS and Apollo private equity firm and Traffic Europe. So, last but not least, we have Marguerite De Tavernost, who is investment director at Cathay Innovation, and we are the Cathay Ledger Fund, 100 million euros early stage venture fund, primarily focused on Web3. She also has a business as an analog, not digital, analog photographer, and NFT creator under the name of Margit. And before that, she was mainly in the venture capital industry also. So, yes, Europe's role in blockchain innovation. That's the topic at hand. We might put it there, past, present, future. Now, the past doesn't interest in so much. It's more like the present. And the question is, where are we in Europe in the blockchain industry? Are we at the forefront, or are we lagging sadly behind, like in Web 2?
I guess I'll start. Well, first off, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's great to be here at this conference, and this might be the wildest room I've ever been in a panel in, so I'm excited to be here for that alone. Look, I would say that Europe has a lot to be excited about, not least Ledger Capital, one of our colleagues and partners and friends in the US, did a report recently where they actually showed that the number of developers in Europe is 8 percentage points higher than it was in 2018. So roughly 36% of all developers in the world are in Europe. And in the US, it's actually down to around 26 percentage points compared to where it was in 2018. So just purely on the developer mindshare perspective, Europe is not doing too badly. But if you look at MiCA, and you compare MiCA to what's going on in this, take for example the US. I mean, the US, there is some good progress happening. You have, the fact that the president had to veto SAB 121, the fact that you've had the industry come together and put together the Fit 21 bill, which whilst there's no legislation being passed, these are both great developments. And if you actually look in the Fit 21 letter, and for those who don't know, this is the industry coming together saying, look, this is what the US needs. It needs clear regulation that the industry can look at and understand what the clear distinction is between different agencies and understand what assets mean and how they're defined. The Fit 21 letter actually refers to Europe as their example. And so I think with Europe, where you have a regime that is explicitly carved out for crypto that says, look, there has to be clear regulation, and there has to be regulation which covers both the issuance, the trading, and custody for digital assets, covers governance, covers both the authorization, protection of investors, but also disclosures so that if folks are investing in things, they understand what the risks are. That's like materially different to what we're seeing in other parts of the world, and I think Europe has a lot to be proud of because of that.
Okay, great. Well, Tim, you're looking at me as if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, these things happen. So firstly, it's very exciting to see more of you than us. That's always a good start. Secondly, it's great to see some of the fine people I was out with last night still alive, as I am. See, the thing about Europe is it's a bit of the old tortoise and hare, isn't it? If you look at all the other jurisdictions on the planet, one way or another, they've had a black eye. So Japan had Mt. Gox, US had FTX in the gut, Singapore was really into things, and then, Temasek and GIC invested in FTX, and that caused everyone to pull back. And you could go around all the other jurisdictions, and there's usually a problem. Look at China. Day one, they're all excited and everybody's at it. Day two, they've just completely banned mining. I remember the day that they came out and banned mining, and everyone's like, oh my God, that we did not see that coming. No one was really expecting that. Then you look at Europe. Slow and steady wins the race, no big blow-ups. Every passing year, we've been talking about how long it's going to take for Mika or Micah, depending on how you want to say it, to come in. But you know what? It's just been consistent. And you think back to some of the early politicians, one in particular, Pierre, who's a lovely guy who's running Usual now, one of the stablecoins, who was a French politician about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And you know what? They were fighting tooth and nail back then for some level of harmonized thinking about how this EU bloc of 333 million should be competitive relative to the rest of the world. And it seemed like a bit of a sort of a very slow and sort of useless race when the US felt like it was on board. And now the US, I don't need to tell you guys, but we all know it. We're looking at the US in its stasis. So I think the story in Europe is it's everything to play for. We just have to not see any material blow-ups that really cause a pullback, which we haven't, and I don't think we will, because there's a sort of embedded conservatism which means we don't go there. It's called being grown up, I think. And as Leon says, the community here is huge. So my message to every regulator, every investment bank, every asset manager, everyone who's in crypto and blockchain in Europe is, it's yours to win, so go do it. And I think there's a chance, but the problem is the US just has to make one volte-face, and the whole thing gets turned on its head. And I think that's sort of what everyone should be worried about, and not worried enough about it, if you ask me.
Margaret, what do you think?
I think, to build on what Leon and Tim have already said, as an investor, actually, it has some implications. So when we look at the US market, usually, historically, the US have always been at the forefront compared to Europe. But actually, when it comes to specific angles of Web3, it's very reassuring for investors to know that the startups and that are being developed are operating within a safe ground, and that there is not this gray area that can be found in Asia or in the US, and where the company can be caught up later on by the regulators. In France, it might be a bit slower. In Europe, it might be a bit slower, but at least the ground is well defined, which allows to know the rules, and you know according to which rules you need to play. And as an investor, you know you won't be caught up later on. And that's probably also why historically there hasn't been any major blow up in Europe, whereas in the other jurisdiction it's a bit more tricky. So for instance, if we looked at specific spaces, for instance, we looked a lot at tokenized T-bills solutions. There are a lot of providers that are either in the US, and there you have players like Ondo Finance that are already at Series B stage and kind of like leading the race. If you look at other jurisdictions, there are a lot of solutions that are registered offshore in the Cayman Islands, etc. But when, as an investor, we looked at the space, we really had in mind to find a player which was registered in a European jurisdiction. And actually, we found one which is regulated by the BaFin in Germany, which is probably the more severe regulator, but that's also very reassuring, because if the company is developed according to that regulation, then we know there won't be any fuck-ups. And so, yeah, in that case, that was an advantage for our sourcing approach.
Okay, great. Well, you mentioned regulation several times, and I wonder if we're talking Europe, is it, how large is the role of regulation? Is it clear and early good regulation? Is it more the open-mindedness of the regulator towards a new and growing industry? Or is it a cultural thing? What's the main factor that put Europe where it is? I mean, you might have
I'll say
already
just
said
two words. I don't think it would be open-mindedness, because I think on that front there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. More education and more specific aspects of the Web3 industry that need to be understood and advocated by the regulators. But it's for sure the defining of clear rules and wanting to put a framework in place for businesses to get developed according to that.
Yeah, I think fully agree. I think what Europe has done, which has been different to the UK, so I live in London, and there are clear distinctions even within Europe, what you're seeing in the EU and what you're seeing in the UK. For example, in Europe, they have a very clear phased implementation process. And not to say that it's better or worse, but in the UK, the typical approach has been a series of more ad hoc, consultative approaches where you sort of check in with industry, and it's iterative. Number two, in Europe, they have made a specific move to ensure that they carve out specific regulation, not within the existing regulation, but specific regulation for crypto assets. And that sets it apart, again, from the UK, where, for example, if you take stablecoins in the UK, they say, well, look, you can regulate stablecoins within existing e-money regulations. In Europe, they say, well, no, guess what? There are new ways of defining assets. We call them ARTs and EMTs, and we're going to put stablecoins in that regulation. Oh, and by the way, we're going to have additional terrorist financing and money laundering rules that you'll need to comply by mid-24. Now, what I think that does for Europe is it enables firms to both understand clearly where things are going, and also allows them to have an implementation process at the national level to make sure that they are compliant with regulations by the time they become law. I think that's useful, and I think Europe does benefit from that, and I don't see that as much in other jurisdictions.
Right. Tim, any comments?
Yeah, look, I think this is a theme that I think we don't talk about enough, and will likely come up as again on this panel. There's nothing new about regulating financial markets, and crypto is just a financial market, whatever way you cut it. So think Basel. Remember there was a thing called Basel, now there's Basel II. Think MiFID, now there's MiFID II. These things always took exactly the same path. It's long periods of giving you years of heads up, and you see these big financial institutions spending inordinate amounts of money with consultants to prepare for these things to come in. And it's just sort of the way of the world. And there's a sort of, back to your point of what's the characteristic of Europe, there's an embedded slow-moving conservatism to it. But there's actually, when you kind of look back, as much as that can be frustrating, especially if you're a financial market player trying to generate commercial outcomes, you don't want to be held back, and you don't want the overhead that goes naturally with that sort of slow and steady build-up. And hey, 5 years from now, you're going to have to do this, so let's all spend the next 5 years worrying about it and paying money for it. The upshot, though, is that it just works, and when it comes in, everyone's ready, and it feels laborious. But I think it's back to my, slow and steady wins the race. I think as long as they keep going in the current trajectory, with the community that exists, there's a real opportunity. I worry, like in the UK is a great example. It's quite interesting when somewhere like the UK decides just to regulate it like everything else. And there's something really kind of meaningful and really a bit weird at the same time about that, but that could be a game changer. For every bank in the UK, and we're talking about HSBC, we're talking about Barclays, we're talking about some of the biggest banks in the world, suddenly can put Bitcoin on the balance sheet or treat it in a way that's very traditional, that's a bit of a game changer. So, you know, Europe does have to be careful, but I maintain it'll slow and steady will win the race.
Yes, carefulness, that's one thing that is a good point, because we know all Sunday elections in Europe, and yeah, the political landscape has changed somewhat. Yeah, I would say personal comment for the worse. But what does it mean for the blockchain industry in Europe? Margaret, let's start with you, because you're from France, so in the EU and in France, the results have been most ground-shaking, I think. So what does it mean for the blockchain industry? Does it have to be worried?
I think firstly, I think the blockchain industry and politics can't really be dissociated. Also, because more than any other industry, the Web3 industry is about a kind of like, there is a philosophical aspect to it, there is a anti-establishment aspect to it, but which is supposed to be for the best in terms of being more open, being more accessible, more transparent. So I think you can't dissociate the economy and this specific movement from the political landscape, which is today taking a direction which is also, in my opinion, not looking good and quite worrying. In terms of the place of Web3 within the political debates and at the European level, Web3 has been discussed, but at a very high level aspect. I think you've got societies like the Aiden Society in France, which is doing a lot of work to try and put Web3 a bit more at the center of the discussion. Aiden is an organization that has 200 members that are companies from either the Web3 industry or financial institutions or established incumbents in the space. And I think they're doing a really tremendous job at the French and European level to kind of educate a bit more the institutions on the interest of the citizen as a consumer, as an investor, as an entrepreneur. But obviously I think today the Web3 industry should be as engaged politically speaking as possible.
Okay, Leon. Leon, I like your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's always tough when talking about politics, but I'll speak about my experience. From what I've observed, there has been, both in the US and in Europe, pretty bipartisan support for digital assets. I referred earlier to, well, the opposition to the accounting suggestions from the SEC, which is SAB 121. I referred to the cross-party sort of letter, the bill, which is the FIT 21 bill in the US. If I think about the UK, my observation personally is that both parties are engaged in digital assets. If I think about Europe, for example, we have the DLT pilot regime and the German Electronic Securities Act, which basically is an act which promotes the on-chain issuance and trading and custody of real-world assets. All of these I've observed so far to be bipartisan. What I think is the case is that there is probably, in general, a move towards protecting economies. And you've seen that a little bit in Europe. Within MiCA, there's regulation to have a regulated stablecoin, and it just so happens that we work with our partners at DWS and Flow Traders to bring that about through All Unity. I don't think that changes. I think we'll begin to see regulated stablecoins in various jurisdictions around the world, and that's just part of a general movement towards protecting economies, and I don't think that changes.
Tim.
I'll credit your current boss, my former boss, Mike Novogratz, for being one of the early players that highlighted the importance of crypto as a political issue. And because he's been saying it for years, and I think it's sort of come true, right? And you just have to look at human nature. Who's being motivated by what? It's always the question you have to ask yourself. Politicians are motivated by voters, and now we can say with some confidence that 10 to 15 to 20% of every large G7 country, their people hold crypto. The number is 50-something million in the US, right? And I think I agree with everything that's been said. It has been sort of a bipartisan issue, but what seems to have changed is, and you know, it's partly to do with Trump firing the Spartan gun and saying something. I'm not going to comment on politics, as we talked about at dinner last night. And don't shoot me down, guys. I've never voted, and I doubt I ever will. I'm sure there's something terrible about that, but I really can't be bothered to spend my time and energy trying to figure out who to vote for when it's a bunch of clowns running around doing what they do. And it's true in a lot of countries, you know, this one, UK, France, US, they're all the same. But what's now happened is it's a real legitimate political hot button voting issue. And I love that that's true, because the libertarian ideals that sort of started all of this are now part of the actual political conversation. That's super healthy. So I think politics is becoming increasingly important and will be more so with time. It's going to become, at some point, some prime minister, someone in power is going to start talking about this in a way that we'll, you know, all hope we're long that day. You know what I mean? It's a big deal.
Yeah, you said you haven't voted at a time. And for example, it was just yesterday, it was here in this room, somebody said, oh, well, in a few years we have artificial intelligence and whole different governments, and there are a lot of people in the industry dreaming the global dream. But can we really afford to be agnostic in politics and say, oh, well, it doesn't concern us, for we are thinking globally? I mean, Margaret already mentioned it with the ADAN, so I take it for the answer, but yeah. Can the industry afford that? Politics don't concern me.
Sorry, can you clarify, can the industry afford what?
Can it, yeah, to say politics don't concern me, I'm a global citizen, we have the global dream, we will break through, we will have a global economy, we have the globalized world, and so those politics are just not happening. For example, of no relevance, I remember like a book from Violet Bulawayo about Zimbabwe, and she put it that way. She wrote, there is the country, and there is the other country. To tell you the truth, in the end, the country spills over in the other country. So,
I mean, the way that I see it, again, I genuinely believe that there is bipartisan support, and that crypto does not have to be a left or a right issue. But that being said, I do think that there has to be a process of education, and that's important because, like, if you take crypto aside, in the world in general, we are at the cusp of like many waves of technology, of which crypto is just one. I mean, there's synthetic biology, there's obviously AI, there's a lot of things going on, and we have a system in place of regulators and government officials who, frankly, are probably not as educated as everyone would like them to be about these topics, in part probably because of bandwidth issues. And so that being the case, I think there is an obligation on industry to have their foot forward and say, hey, by the way, this is what we think makes sense in terms of regulation, and to do that in a way which maintains integrity and is not entirely self-serving. So I do think that's the case, and for what it's worth, I actually do think that's happening. I think I look at certainly what Galaxy's been doing in its engagement with regulators in the US and in Europe, and we make an effort to argue what we think is common sense regulation, which both promotes innovation but also protects consumers and those who are engaging the space who don't have the same amount of information. So I actually do think that's happening. When it comes to the other thing which I think is interesting is that there are overlaps between the technologies, for example, in the mining space, and I think that's also interesting for regulators to be aware of. For example, if you look at the mining assets in the digital asset space now, if you take a look at what's been going on there, you've seen massive increases in the price of miners in the last week or two. And that's mainly because of the narrative of high-performance compute in the mining space and digital assets being potentially used in the field of AI. Now, that's great for some crypto asset firms. Obviously, we're lucky enough to benefit from the lowest cost Bitcoin mining facilities in the US. But I think what that also means is that if you're looking at it from a regulatory perspective, you actually have these two industries that you think are separate, but actually they're more similar than you think, and they meet at this space of crypto mining. that's not obvious. And so having someone sitting down with officials and explaining that to them is probably useful. So to answer your question, I think engagement from industry is I think, the way forward there.
Okay, great. Now let's have a look at future. Time's running short, so we'll keep that, unfortunately, a little shorter. But what does European blockchain industry need most now to reach the next level? Well, Leon might start as well. You were just speaking. So.
What does Europe need to get to the next?
We have said that Europe is in a good state. But it has to grow, it has to reach the next level of the blockchain industry. What does it need the most?
So I think there are two things. I think one, there is was what we like from regulators, and then there's two, what I think the industry can do a better job of. So I think that from the regulatory side, there are lots of things which are still not yet done. So for example, if you take MiCA, it is still relatively light on prudential regulation, for example, in the lending space. If you take a look at, on the industry side, I think we could do a better job of creating assets where the user experience is much more like Web 2 than it is Web 3. For what it's worth, I think that's happening. If you look at, I think Coinbase, for example, I think they've done a great job with Base. I think it's like a phenomenal layer 2 on ETH, and I think that the user experience is becoming more and more like you'd expect in Web 2. So I think these things are happening, but they're just happening. These things take time. And so I'm pretty optimistic, but we might just need to wait a bit.
So, Margaret, what do you say? What do we need most?
Yeah, I think the adoption issue is a global issue, to be honest. And I think that's core to the adoption of Web3, and that's also why recently we've seen a lot of evolution in the financial asset space, also because there are more institutions entering the space with spot Bitcoin ETF and maybe soon the ETH ETF. So I think for that we need at the US or at the European level more and more institutions just entering the blockchain wave, and that's always a reassuring block in the adoption process that will then bring the retail investors in the blockchain race. We need still more VC funding. Looking at Europe, I think that's more and more the case. We have large tier 1 US funds investing in Europe. I think we need more and more of that, because historically, if you look at the US market, it's still like the US market is still ahead of the race in terms of funding and exits. But yeah, I would say those are the two factors.
Tim?
Yeah, I think if you look at how, we can forget that crypto is just an asset, and the mechanism to bring significant amount of capital into a capital market has existed for decades. And therefore, and this is not a European thing, this is a global thing, like there are basic foundations, primitives that you need in order for a capital market to work. You need liquidity, you need credit creation, you need collateral to be able to be exchanged between players in a liberal manner, and you want to do that using this new tool set that allows you to do it not T+1 and have boatloads of capital tied up. So the entire industry, and this is not a Europe thing, it's not a crypto thing, it's a global capital markets thing, needs to really start building that infrastructure. It's really notable as only one, and there are many examples, that there's such a small amount of risk capital that's available to institutional players to be able to lend and borrow, and that is the lifeblood of capital markets. When I used to work at UBS O'Connor, the hedge fund, we had 6 billion of client money, but we had 24 billion of firepower every single day. Why? Because we had 11 prime brokers, and the basic foundational element of a capital market and what creates liquidity and a price discovery and all the things that define a capital market is things like leverage and credit provisioning, and we just don't have it. So I think what we need is those things to be built, and it does come back to you need traditional players to invest and bring their material infrastructure, but it's also, at the end of the day, it needs capital. You need people to apply risk capital to a situation, and then you can grow that market. And that's what we're missing. We need large-scale investment of risk capital into the space.
Now let me ask here if there are any questions of the audience. I think, yeah, Nova, would you be so kind to give him a mic?
Sorry.
You just like walking, right? Oh, thank you. I think it's a very good insight. I was making a lot of notes. I have so many questions. I'll just go with one simple. I fully agree with all of you and what Tim said. But I used to work in Citibank, and the ex-CEO said it cost $5 billion each year just to manage middle office team across the world. Just $5 billion. Just to do the paperwork. I used to do that. I was a part of that team. So yeah. And what you said, like what Europe is missing, I live in Europe, and I think what's missing is the capital.
Well, your point is well taken, right? Like I remember when I had my blockchain genesis moment, right? I had a different crypto moment. And you have a moment where you suddenly get the joke on what blockchain is. Mine was because, actually, this is true, because of the 11 prime brokers that we had as a hedge fund. You try connecting with 11 prime brokers trading billions of different asset classes a day over those prime brokers and reconciling your positions at the end of the day. Yeah. It's a horrifically expensive thing to do. Yeah. It's massively inefficient. Now, you could blockchainify that, which is always sort of a dangerous term to use, but you could throw a blockchain at that and remove the need for that reconciliation. To me, what you're saying, that alone, never mind credit provisioning and liquidity and all the other things, that could save hundreds of billions a year around the planet. And we're not even close to getting there yet. So the opportunity is massive.
Yeah. So my question is mainly about why the investors in Europe are not investing very proactively. Because this is, I see, because they're amazing builders. I live in Europe. I was doing the back office management for Man GLG Group, which is the biggest hedge fund of Europe. We were making 40,000 trades a day. And when I realized blockchain, I quit my job. I'm like, that technology is going to kill my job. And this is how 7 years ago I jumped into the crypto market. And
look, I will say a few things. Number one, clearly on-chain settlement is like a big opportunity for blockchain. Number two, you actually are seeing investors in Europe. I think Robinhood recently bought Bitstamp, Galaxy Service as the advisor for Bitstamp in that transaction, and you're beginning to see consolidation in the space. Number three, I sort of alluded to it earlier, but there's entrepreneurship taking place. Ourselves, DWS, Flow Traders came together to put together Unity, which we hope is going to be one of the leading regulated stablecoins in Europe. So from my perspective, I actually do see that taking place. It might be different on the VC side, I acknowledge, but I do think there is activity, is my take.
The next big blockchain innovation thing, in my view, is programmable operation. It's a pretty new thing for what I mean outside, because the world took over on blockchains, the world took over on wallets, but nobody took over yet on programmable operations, which is the next thing using account abstraction. So, any thoughts on this?
Okay, good.
I'm conscious of any other questions as well, but I mean, clearly there's lots of programmable transactions through the smart contracts on chain already. Like the challenge, the challenge I think right now is that if you want to include this thing in the traditional financial infrastructure, there's going to have to be a hell of a lot of testing, and there's going to have to be a hell of a lot of process that you work through to make sure that banks and governments and regulators are happy that we're running the economy on this. But guess what? It's happening. There's literally a DLT pilot regime in Europe, and they are tokenizing and issuing bonds, real estate, and other assets in real time right now. So I think it is taking place, but I think it just takes time.
So unfortunately, time's up. I would have liked to continue the discussion for hours, I think. So thank you all for coming here, and have a good rest of the day. And thank you all for the panelists, and give them a round of applause.